bring it to completion. Now, I want to just be honest about something that we've talked about this morning. Some of you are very aware and this is what I'm about to do is enter into kind of a parentheses of the sermon, okay? I'm going to step out and just have an honest conversation with everybody. We've been using some words right now that have created great debate historically in foreknowledge and predestination and calling and even election, okay? And I just want to acknowledge the tension, okay? Some of you are like, oh, hold on. If God predestined people, do we have any choice in anything? But because I see in Scripture elsewhere, it feels like we have choice. But I almost feel like you're saying that God is completely in charge of all of it and we don't have choice. And that's really confusing to me. And it's confusing to me too, okay? So I'll just say that right now. I don't have the exact answer. But there's this debate between God's sovereignty and man's responsibility that has raged for centuries. And so I just want to say, we're going to be talking about it the next few weeks. We're going to be wading into some of those waters as we go. But what I want to do for us is maybe if we could, first of all, make this less of a debate and more of a conversation where if I could provide maybe a framework for us to think through these things. And the first is this, that we would do so in humility and not arrogance. That we would come saying, man, I don't understand this, but I'm going to just seek the Scripture. And as I talk with other people about it, it's not in contention. It's not in I know I'm right and you must be wrong because I'm right, so that must make you wrong. That's a debate. Let's have a conversation, not a debate. Let's in humility approach the Scripture and not think that though for centuries, brilliant theologians have not come to complete consensus on this, but you in your basement somehow figured it all out, okay? And maybe you're the one, and I would love to hang out with you, okay? But I think there's always going to be this tension there. And so let's approach it in humility and have a conversation, not a debate. Second, we've got to look at the whole counsel of Scripture. We can't just pick Romans 8 and 9 and build a whole theology on that, okay, and not look at Romans 10 or not look at all these other places in Scripture where it seems, when you look at Scripture, there's clear precedent for man's responsibility. There's some choice by man. There's a responsibility with what to do with the gospel. But there's also seems there's clear precedent in Scripture for God's sovereignty and his choice and his ordaining things and his election. And so what we've got to understand is that we got to look at all of the Scripture, not build a theology on just little bits and pieces of it. Does that make sense? And then finally, that we need to understand there's an intersection beyond our comprehension. There's an intersection beyond our comprehension. And so what I would say, just from a diagram standpoint, is this, that there is clear precedent scripturally for man's responsibility, okay? There's precedent for man's responsibility, and there's precedent for God's sovereignty. Now, as we can't figure out how those things meet each other, it's kind of like, okay, what do I do with that? And it seems too hard for me, and often for me for a long time, I was like, I'm just not going to worry about it. It's not a big deal to me. Like, somebody else will figure it out. And that's not a good response either, because I think we can grow in our knowledge of both of those things. So over time, let that develop wonder, and then we can grow. We're going to grow in our knowledge of those things, maybe understand we're getting a little closer to seeing how maybe they intersect, but we're not quite there, because I do believe that it's beyond our level of comprehension. That there is this, we're going to hit this kind of almost a wall where we can't understand above that. So it's kind of above the line for us, okay? But I do want to say with clarity that man's responsibility and God's sovereignty are not contradictory doctrines. They work in complete synergy with each other. But it's just above what we can comprehend, but it's not above what God comprehends, because it comes together. He knows in his glorious wisdom that's way beyond ours, these things work perfectly congruently. They work together. And so I challenge us as a faith family to wade in these waters, not run away from them. Let's have conversations. Let's study the Scripture. Let this drive us to the Scripture, if anything, and dependence on the Lord to say, help me with this. I don't understand it. But let's also let it develop an awe of God and his wisdom. And I think Paul lands there in chapter 11 at the end. He's like, oh man, how deep the riches of God, how beyond my understanding, how unsearchable are his ways. Like, we just can't understand it totally. And let it blow our minds and how great God is. And so as a faith family, let's walk into those waters in humility, whole counsel of Scripture, walking through it. And on our end, what we're going to try and do is the teaching team is met. We're going to do our best just to teach what the Scripture says and try not to draw too many opinion-based conclusions on the Scripture. We're going to just, here it is, and you guys, let's just kind of all wrestle with it together. So that's kind of where we're headed. Does that kind of make sense? Is that good? So let's not run from this. Now, what I want to do